In the chaotic opening months of the First World War, a single German light cruiser paralyzed the trade routes of the British Empire and captivated the world with a display of audacity, cunning, and nearly extinct chivalry. While the trenches of Europe filled with blood and mud, the SMS Emden and her captain, Karl von Miller, waged a gentlemanly war across the Indian Ocean, seizing dozens of ships without killing a single merchant sailor. They became phantoms of the high seas, striking out of the mist with a fake funnel to disguise their identity, bombarding enemy ports, and treating their prisoners with such respect that even their enemies cheered them. But as the net tightened and the might of the Allied navies converged on this lone wolf, the Emden steamed toward a remote coral atoll for one final fiery stand that would mark the end of the age of naval romance and the beginning of modern mechanical slaughter. Chapter 1: The Swan of the East. The year was 1914, and the world stood on the precipice of a change so violent it would rewrite history forever. But in the warm waters of the Yellow Sea, specifically within the German concession of Tsingtao on the coast of China, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. Here, amidst German colonial architecture that looked as though it had been plucked from Bavaria and dropped onto the Chinese coastline, sat a warship of exceptional beauty. Her name was the SMS Emden. To the sailors who served aboard her and the locals who watched her navigate the harbor, she was known affectionately as the Swan of the East. It was a fitting nickname. In peacetime, she was painted a brilliant, pristine white with three tall funnels colored a bright ochre yellow. Her lines were graceful and sharp, cutting through the water with an elegance that belied her purpose as a weapon of war. She was a light cruiser of the Dresden class, designed for speed and scouting rather than the brute force of a battleship. In the summer of 1914, the Emden was the pride of the German East Asia Squadron. The station at Tsingtao was a unique outpost, a slice of European life in the Far East where officers enjoyed tennis matches and grand balls at the Strand Hotel. However, the telegrams arriving from Berlin were becoming increasingly grim. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had set off a chain reaction of alliances and ultimatums. The crew of the Emden, thousands of miles from home, could feel the tension in the air. The lazy days of colonial patrol were ending. At the helm of this beautiful ship was Fregatten Capitan Karl von Miller. Captain Miller was 41 years old, a man of quiet intensity and aristocratic bearing. He was not a man prone to loud outbursts or theatrics. Instead, he commanded with a calm, intellectual authority that inspired absolute devotion in his men. He was a student of history and naval strategy, and as he looked out over the harbor of Tsingtao, he understood the gravity of their situation better than anyone. Miller knew that the German East Asia Squadron, commanded by the formidable Admiral Maximilian von Spee, was powerful, but it was isolated. If war broke out, they would be cut off from Germany, with no friendly ports to resupply coal or ammunition. Worse, the waters of the Pacific would soon be swarming with the ships of the British Royal Navy, the French, the Russians, and potentially the Japanese Imperial Navy. The Emden, with her light armor and 4-inch guns, was not built to stand in the line of battle against heavy cruisers or battleships. In a direct confrontation with the enemy's main fleets, the Swan of the East would be crushed. The final days of July brought a frenzy of activity to Tsingtao. The leisurely pace of colonial life vanished overnight. The order came to prepare for sea. This meant coaling, the most backbreaking and hated task in the Navy. Under the sweltering summer sun, the crew of the Emden worked until they dropped. Clouds of black dust choked the air as sack after sack of coal was hauled aboard and dumped into the bunkers. Officers and enlisted men alike ended their shifts coated in grime, their eyes white circles and blackened faces. They loaded provisions, livestock for fresh meat, and extra ammunition. The pristine white decks of the Swan were now covered in coal dust, a foreshadowing of the dark times ahead. On July 31st, 1914, just days before the official declaration of war between Germany and Britain, the Emden slipped out of Tsingtao. As she left the harbor, the band on the pier played patriotic tunes, and the remaining German residents waved farewell. Many of them must have wondered if they would ever see the ship or her crew again. Captain Miller stood on the bridge, watching the German colony fade into the mist. He knew that the safety of the port was now a thing of the past. From this moment on, they were homeless wanderers. The initial days at sea were filled with high anxiety. War had erupted in Europe, and the Emden was immediately on the hunt. Her first taste of action came quickly when she captured the Russian steamer Ryazan. It was a bloodless victory, but it proved that Miller and his crew were ready. However, a single prize was not the ultimate goal. Miller had to rendezvous with his superior, Admiral von Spee, who was gathering his armored cruisers, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, deep in the Pacific at Pagan Island in the Marianas. The journey to Pagan Island was a tense game of cat and mouse. The radio room buzzed with the signals of enemy ships. The Japanese fleet was mobilizing, and British hunters were prowling the trade routes. When the Emden finally arrived at the volcanic outpost of Pagan Island on August 12th, the sight was impressive. The massive armored cruisers of the East Asia Squadron lay at anchor, colliers alongside them preparing for a long voyage across the Pacific to South America. Admiral von Spee planned to keep his squadron together. He believed that by staying as a concentrated force, he could fight his way around Cape Horn and eventually return to Germany, or at least draw significant British resources away from the North Sea. It was a sound strategy for the heavy ships, but Captain Miller had a different idea for his light cruiser. Miller requested a private audience with the admiral aboard the flagship SMS Scharnhorst. The contrast between the two ships was stark. The Scharnhorst was a heavily armored brawler built for fleet action. The Emden was a raider built for speed and endurance. In the admiral's cabin, with maps of the vast ocean spread out before them, Miller presented his daring proposal. He argued that if the Emden remained with the main squadron, she would be nothing more than a scout, tethered to the slower speed of the colliers and the heavy ships. In a major battle, her light guns would make little difference. However, if she were released to operate independently, she could become a phantom. Miller pointed to the map of the Indian Ocean. It was a vast expanse of water, crisscrossed by British trade routes connecting India, Australia, and the Far East to the Suez Canal and Europe. Miller proposed that the Emden should slip away alone into the Indian Ocean. There, she would wage a commerce war, sinking British merchant shipping and disrupting trade. This would cause panic in London and force the British Admiralty to divert vital warships from the European theater to hunt down a single German cruiser. He argued that the disruption and economic damage caused by one rogue ship would be far more valuable to the German war effort than adding one light cruiser to Spee's line of battle. It was a suicide mission, and both men knew it. Without the protection of the squadron, the Emden would be entirely alone. She would have no friendly ports. She would have to source her own coal and food from captured ships. And eventually, the British would catch her. The Royal Navy had dozens of cruisers faster and more powerful than the Emden. It was not a question of if they would be destroyed, but when. Admiral von Spee listened intently. He respected Miller as one of his finest officers. He looked at the map, then at the captain. He understood the strategic brilliance of the plan. By splitting his forces, he would force the British to split theirs. With a heavy heart but a clear strategic mind, Spee granted the request. The news of the separation rippled through the crew of the Emden. They were leaving the safety of the big guns. They were heading into the lion's den. But rather than fear, a sense of grim determination and excitement took hold of the sailors. They trusted their captain. If Miller said they could do it, they believed they could. On August 14th, 1914, the signal flags fluttered up the mast of the flagship. Detach and proceed. The Emden weighed anchor. As she steamed past the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the crews of the heavy cruisers lined the rails and cheered. The bands played, and hats were waved in the air. It was a final salute between brothers in arms who knew they would likely never meet again. The Emden turned her bow south, away from the squadron, away from the Pacific, and toward the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean. Now, the transformation began in earnest. The Swan of the East had to shed her peacetime plumage. The beautiful white paint and yellow funnels were liabilities now. They made the ship a target visible for miles against the dark blue of the ocean. The order was given to repaint the entire ship. The crew swarmed over the sides of the vessel, suspended by ropes and sitting on planks. They mixed pots of dark gray paint, the color of a stormy sea and war shadows. Inch by inch, the bright white hull vanished. The yellow funnels were coated in drab gray. Even the canvas awnings and the lifeboats were painted. The elegant yacht-like appearance of the Emden disappeared, replaced by the menacing, functional look of a shark. She was no longer a diplomat, she was a predator. Inside the ship, the atmosphere changed as well. The woodwork was stripped away or covered to prevent splinters in combat. Anything flammable that wasn't essential was discarded. The ship was cleared for action. The officers, who had once dressed in crisp white uniforms for dinner, now wore practical service dress. The drills became relentless. Gun crews practiced loading and aiming until their movements were fluid and automatic. Damage control parties rehearsed sealing breaches and fighting fires. Captain Miller paced the bridge, his mind constantly working. He knew that the success of this mission relied on deception and unpredictability. He could not simply sail into shipping lanes and open fire. He had to be cunning. He had to appear where the British least expected him, strike hard and vanish before the Royal Navy could react. He began to formulate ruses that would become legendary. He studied the silhouettes of British cruisers, noting that many of them had 4 funnels while the Emden had only 3. He sketched designs for a fake 4th funnel made of canvas and wood, something that could be erected quickly to confuse distant observers into thinking the Emden was a friend rather than a foe. As the Emden pushed deeper into the lonely expanse of the ocean, the heat became oppressive. They were entering the tropics. The stokers in the engine room worked in temperatures that soared well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a hellish existence, shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces to keep the ship moving, but morale remained incredibly high. The men felt they were part of something special. They were the lone wolves of the Kaiser, challenging the might of the greatest naval power on Earth. Miller addressed his crew, gathering them on the gray deck. He spoke plainly, without the bombast of a politician. He told them that their duty was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy's commerce. He emphasized that they were to fight as gentlemen. They would sink ships, yes, but they would not kill innocent civilians. The rules of war would be strictly observed. They would treat prisoners with dignity. This chivalrous code would come to define the legend of the Emden, earning Miller respect even from those he defeated. The sun set over the Indian Ocean, casting long shadows across the water. The Emden was now completely alone, a tiny gray speck in a vast hostile world. The radio operator listened to the chatter of British merchant ships, unaware that a predator was moving among them. The preparations were complete. The Swan of the East had died, and in her place, a raider was born. Captain Carl von Miller looked at the horizon, his face set in a mask of calm determination. The easy days of Tsingtao were a lifetime ago. Ahead of them lay glory, danger, and an inevitable fiery end. But before that end came, they would make the world tremble. The Emden steamed on, her engines thrumming a steady rhythm, ready to write the first chapter of a legend that would survive long after her guns fell silent. The hunt was on. Chapter 2: A Wolf in Ship's Clothing. The silence of the Indian Ocean was deceptive. To the uninitiated, the Bay of Bengal was nothing more than an endless expanse of blue water and tropical heat. But to Captain Carl von Miller, it was a highway. This was one of the busiest shipping lanes in the British Empire, a vital artery connecting India to the Far East, and eventually to Great Britain itself. Every day, merchant vessels laden with tea, rubber, jute, and precious metals steamed across these waters, confident in the protection of the Royal Navy. They believed the seas were safe. They believed the war was a distant thunder happening far away in Europe. Miller intended to shatter that illusion. However, the Emden faced a significant problem. While she was a predator, she was also a target. The Bay of Bengal was not entirely unguarded, and British cruisers patrolled the region. The silhouette of the Emden was distinct. Like most German light cruisers of her class, she possessed 3 tall smokestacks or funnels. This profile was instantly recognizable to any seasoned sailor or naval officer. In contrast, British cruisers in the region, particularly those of the Yarmouth or Weymouth classes, typically sported 2 or 4 funnels. If a British lookout spotted a 3-funneled warship on the horizon, the alarm would be raised immediately, and the hunter would become the hunted. Miller knew he needed to buy time. He needed to get close enough to his victims to inspect them without causing them to flee or radio for help. His solution was a stroke of theatrical genius born of necessity. As the Emden steamed quietly toward the shipping routes, Miller called upon his crew to engage in a peculiar construction project. He ordered the ship's carpenters and canvas makers to build a fourth funnel. The crew set to work with enthusiasm, treating the task almost as a prank. They constructed a wooden framework, oval in shape, to match the dimensions of the existing steel smokestacks. Over this skeleton, they stretched gray canvas sailcloth, painted to match the weather-beaten hue of the ship's real funnels. They hoisted this dummy structure into place immediately behind the forward funnel. From a distance, the transformation was remarkable. The Emden no longer looked like a German raider. She now cut the profile of a British town-class cruiser. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing, or more accurately, a German wolf in British clothing. This disguise allowed her to steam boldly toward potential targets, who would assume she was a friendly protector right up until the moment the German naval ensign was hoisted and a warning shot was fired. The stage was set. On September 10th, 1914, the Emden entered the primary shipping lane between Colombo and Calcutta. It did not take long for the ruse to work. Just after 9 in the morning, the lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. It was a merchant vessel, steaming steadily on a course that would bring her right across the path of the raider. The ship was the Indus, a British freighter of nearly 3,500 tons, chartered by the Indian government to transport supplies. The captain of the Indus saw the warship approaching but felt no alarm. Through his binoculars, he saw the four funnels and the gray paint of the Royal Navy. He assumed he was being approached by a friendly patrol, perhaps coming to check his papers or share news of the war. He held his course, completely unaware that he was sailing directly into the guns of the enemy. It was only when the Emden was less than a mile away that the trap was sprung. The false funnel did its job perfectly. As the distance closed, the German battle flag, the Reichskriegsflag, fluttered up the mast. A blank shot from one of the forward guns cracked across the water, a universal signal to stop engines immediately. The captain of the Indus was stunned. The friendly British cruiser had instantaneously transformed into a German raider. He had no time to react, no time to man a radio, and certainly no ability to outrun a light cruiser. The Indus slowed to a halt, rolling gently in the swell. A boarding party from the Emden motored across the water. This was the moment where the legend of the Emden began to take its true shape. In the brutal logic of war, a commerce raider might be expected to be harsh, perhaps even cruel. But Miller had instilled a different discipline in his men. As the German officers stepped onto the deck of the Indus, they did not come as barbarians. They were polite, professional, and rigidly formal. They apologized to the British captain for the inconvenience and informed him that his ship was now a prize of the German Imperial Navy. The orders were clear. The Indus was to be scuttled, but not before everything of value was removed. For the crew of the Emden, who had been at sea for weeks without resupply, this was a harvest. They transferred soap, cigarettes, flour, and fresh meat from the freighter's stores to the cruiser. But the most important cargo was the people. Miller's standing order was that no life was to be lost during these captures. The crew of the Indus was given time to pack their personal belongings. German sailors even assisted the British merchantmen in carrying their sea chests to the waiting cutters. There was no shouting, no violence, and no humiliation. Once the prisoners and supplies were safely aboard the Emden and her accompanying collier, the Marcomania, the end came for the Indus. The German boarding party opened the ship's seacocks, flooding her hull. To hasten the process, they fired shells into the waterline. The steel groaned and the freighter began to list heavily. Slowly, agonizingly, she slipped beneath the surface of the Bay of Bengal, leaving only a swirl of foam and debris. On the bridge of the Emden, Miller watched with a stoic expression. He was a sailor first, and watching a ship die was never a joyous occasion, even if it was the enemy. The sinking of the Indus was the beginning of a spree that would leave the British Admiralty breathless. The Emden did not flee the scene to hide. Instead, Miller stayed right in the shipping lane, confident in his disguise and his tactics. The very next afternoon, smoke was spotted again. This time it was the Lovat, a troop ship heavily laden with horses and equipment. The scenario repeated itself with terrifying efficiency. The four-funneled silhouette approached, the merchant captain relaxed, and then the trap snapped shut. The Lovat was captured without a single shot fired in anger. The crew was transferred, treated with the same startling courtesy, and then the ship was sent to the bottom. The Emden was becoming crowded with prisoners, but Miller refused to compromise on their safety. He would not cast them adrift in lifeboats miles from land. They were guests of the Kaiser, housed on the Emden or the Markomania, fed from the raiders' own stores, and treated with respect. The sheer volume of traffic in the Bay of Bengal played into Miller's hands. On September 12th, the Emden captured the Kabinga. This ship posed a dilemma. She carried a British cargo, but her owner was American, and the United States was a neutral power. Furthermore, the captain's wife and child were on board. Miller, ever the gentleman, decided he could not subject a woman and child to the dangers of a prisoner of war environment, nor could he risk a diplomatic incident with America. He made a decision that would serve him well in the court of public opinion. He spared the Kabinga. Instead of sinking her, Miller designated the Kabinga as a prison ship. He transferred the growing population of captured crews from the Indus and the Lovat onto the neutral vessel. The decks of the Kabinga became a strange melting pot of British sailors, Indian lascars, and officers, all sharing stories of the polite German pirate who had captured them. But the Emden was not done. On September 13th, she encountered the Diplomat, a massive vessel carrying thousands of tons of high-grade tea. The captain of the Diplomat, like those before him, was completely deceived by the fake funnel. He only realized his mistake when the German ensign broke out. The loss of the Diplomat was a financial blow to the British Empire, but it was also a symbolic one. The tea meant for British breakfast tables was now floating in the Indian Ocean. Before the Diplomat was sunk, the Emden claimed yet another victim, the Killen, loaded with thousands of tons of coal. By now, the routine was perfected. Spot, approach, signal, board, evacuate, scuttle. The efficiency was machine-like, but the humanity remained intact. When the Kabinga was finally released to sail for Calcutta, she carried with her hundreds of prisoners, but she also carried a story. The released sailors did not speak of atrocities or cruelty. They spoke of a German captain who saluted them as they boarded his ship, who ensured they had cigarettes and food, and who apologized for the necessity of sinking their vessels. They spoke of the Emden appearing out of nowhere, a ghost ship that could change its shape. When the Kabinga arrived in Calcutta, the news hit the city like a bomb. The port went into an immediate panic. The reality of the situation was far worse than the rumors. The Emden was not just sinking ships. She was operating with impunity in waters that were supposed to be under total British control. The reaction was instantaneous and severe. The British Admiralty ordered a complete halt to shipping in the Bay of Bengal. Vessels were ordered to stay in port. The great harbors of India fell silent. The flow of goods stopped. In London, the insurance rates for shipping in the Indian Ocean skyrocketed overnight. The war risk premiums jumped to panic-inducing levels, effectively paralyzing trade even for those brave enough to sail. The Emden had achieved something remarkable. With a single light cruiser and a fake smokestack made of wood and canvas, Carl von Miller had exerted more pressure on the British economy than a fleet of battleships. He had created a myth of ubiquity. To the British naval commanders hunting him, it seemed as though the Emden was everywhere at once. Reports of phantom sightings poured in from all over the ocean. Every shadow on the horizon was the Emden. Every mechanical breakdown was attributed to German saboteurs. The Royal Navy was humiliated. They scrambled nearly 20 warships to hunt down this one rogue cruiser. They crisscrossed the Bay of Bengal, burning thousands of tons of coal, desperate to bring Miller to battle. But the Emden was always gone. She would strike, vanish into the vast blue emptiness, and reappear hundreds of miles away, sporting her disguise, ready to claim another victim. For the crew of the Emden, these were the golden days. They were working hard, fueling at sea, boarding ships, and maintaining the deception, but morale was sky high. They knew they were making history. They were the wolf in the fold, the fox in the henhouse. But Miller remained grounded. He knew that the stopping of shipping meant no more targets in this specific area. The silence of the radio and the empty horizon told him that the game in the Bay of Bengal was coming to an end. The surprise was gone. The sheep had fled the pasture. The safe transfer of the prisoners onto the Kabinga had been an act of mercy, but it also gave away his position. The British now knew exactly where he had been. The hunters were converging. The invisible net was tightening. Miller looked at his charts. He had paralyzed the trade routes of India, humiliated the Royal Navy, and cost the British Empire millions in lost cargo and insurance hikes. It was time to move. It was time to vanish again and strike where they least expected it. The fake funnel had served its purpose, but the Emden had to evolve once more. The Wolf turned its gaze south, toward the oil tanks of Madras, ready to escalate the war from commerce raiding to direct bombardment. The legend was growing, but the danger was growing with it. Chapter 3. Fire over Madras. The decision to attack Madras was a gamble of the highest order. Until this moment, Captain Carl von Miller had played the role of a gentleman pirate, intercepting merchant vessels on the open ocean, checking their manifests, and sinking them only after ensuring the safety of their crews. He had operated in the vast, ungoverned spaces of the Bay of Bengal, where the only law was the one he enforced with his guns. But the ocean was emptying. The shipping lanes were silent. The British Admiralty, finally realizing the scale of the threat, had halted traffic. To remain at sea was to starve, both of coal and of targets. Miller understood that warfare is as much psychological as it is physical. He did not have the manpower to invade India, nor did he have the fleet to challenge the Royal Navy in a pitched battle. He was one ship against an empire. To continue the fight, he had to shatter the illusion of British invincibility. He had to prove that the Royal Navy, the supposed mistress of the seas, could not protect its own subjects, even in their most secure cities. He turned the bow of the SMS Emden toward the Coromandel coast. The target was Madras. It was one of the jewels of the British Raj, a bustling commercial hub, and a symbol of imperial stability. It was also home to massive oil storage facilities operated by the Burma Oil Company. These tanks held millions of gallons of kerosene and fuel, the lifeblood of the modern economy and the Navy. Destroying them would be a tactical blow to British logistics, but the visual spectacle of a city on fire would be a strategic blow to British morale. The approach began on the evening of September 22, 1914. The Emden was once again disguised. The canvas and wood structure of the fake fourth funnel was raised, changing the silhouette of the German light cruiser to match that of a British County-class vessel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the ship became a shadow gliding through the dark waters. The crew moved with practiced silence. Every man on board knew the stakes. They were not hunting unarmed merchant ships anymore. They were sailing directly into the throat of a defended harbor, within range of shore batteries that could easily cripple their ship. The lights of Madras appeared on the horizon, a glowing haze that grew distinct as the miles vanished. To the officers on the bridge, the city looked peaceful. Street lamps traced the lines of the coast, and the lights of the harbor signaled a world unaware of the predator closing in. It was a surreal sight for sailors who had spent weeks in the harsh isolation of the sea. They were looking at civilization at homes and businesses, knowing that in less than an hour, they would bring chaos to those quiet streets. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the Emden was less than 2 miles from the harbor entrance. The weather was calm, and the visibility was perfect. Miller displayed a terrifying coolness. He navigated the ship closer, shaving the distance down to a mere 3,000 yards. He was so close that the crew could see the headlights of cars moving along the beach roads. The British shore defenses remained silent. They saw the 4 funnels in the distance and assumed, just as the captains of the merchant ships had, that this was a friendly vessel patrolling the coast. The disguise had worked again. At roughly 9:30, the order was given. The deception was over. Captain Miller ordered the searchlights of the Emden to be switched on. In an instant, brilliant beams of white light cut through the tropical darkness, stabbing toward the shore. They swept across the harbor, bypassing the few ships anchored there, and settled on the large, white-painted oil tanks standing in a row near the water's edge. They stood out like ghosts against the black background of the city. The silence of the night was shattered by the sharp crack of the starboard battery. The first salvo roared from the 10.5-centimeter guns. The shells screamed across the short stretch of water. The first shots fell slightly short, splashing into the sea and onto the beach, sending plumes of water and sand into the air. The gunnery officer made a quick correction. The elevation was adjusted. The guns roared again. This time, the aim was true. The shells slammed into the metal sides of the oil tanks. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic. The fuel inside the tanks ignited instantly. A pillar of flame erupted into the obsidian sky, turning the tropical night into a blood-red dawn. The heat was intense enough to be felt across the water, a physical blow that announced the war had truly arrived in India. Two of the massive tanks were ripped open, spilling their burning contents out in a terrifying flood. The scene in the harbor was one of absolute majesty and horror. The flames leaped hundreds of feet into the air, dwarfing the buildings around them. Thick, black smoke began to billow upward, blotting out the stars illuminated from below by the raging inferno. The fire was so bright that it was later reported to be visible for nearly 50 miles at sea. On the Emden, the gunners worked with mechanical precision. They fired roughly 130 shells in a span of 10 minutes. They did not just target the oil tanks. They poured fire into the harbor installations and the shore. A merchant ship, the Chupra, which was anchored in the harbor, was struck by stray shells. It was not the intended target, but in the chaos of the bombardment, precision gave way to destruction. A cadet on the Chupra was killed, and several others were wounded, marking the first blood spilled in Madras. The city woke up to a nightmare. The sound of the guns echoed through the streets like thunder, shaking the foundations of colonial bungalows and crowded tenements alike. Glass shattered in windows miles away. For the civilians on the shore, there was no understanding of what was happening. There was no air raid siren, no warning. There was only the sudden eruption of the world. The British shore batteries finally responded, but their reaction was confused and ineffective. They had been caught completely off guard. Searchlights from the shore began to sweep the water, frantically looking for the attacker, but the Emden had already done its work. The shore guns fired blindly into the darkness, their shells landing harmlessly in the sea miles away from the German cruiser. Miller, seeing the batteries waking up and the mission accomplished, gave the order to cease fire. He had no intention of getting into a duel with land-based artillery. He had struck his blow. He ordered the helm hard over. The Emden extinguished her searchlights, plunging herself back into the safety of the gloom. Like a phantom, she turned away from the burning coast and slipped back into the vast anonymity of the Bay of Bengal. Behind them, they left a city in pandemonium. The fire at the Burma Oil Company installation raged uncontrollably. It would burn for days, a constant smoking reminder of the German Navy's reach. But the physical damage, which amounted to hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel lost, was nothing compared to the psychological impact. Panic gripped Madras. The illusion of safety was gone. The British Raj, which had projected an image of eternal stability and protective power, had failed to stop a single ship from shelling a major city. Rumors spread faster than the fire. People whispered that this was the vanguard of a German invasion fleet. They said that German troops were landing on the beaches. The name Emden was spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. The following morning, the true scale of the panic became visible. The railway station in Madras was besieged. Thousands of civilians, terrified that the cruiser would return the next night to finish the job, packed their belongings and fled. Trains were filled to bursting, with people hanging off the sides and sitting on the roofs, desperate to get inland away from the coast. The local economy stumbled. Prices for food and basic goods fluctuated wildly. The workforce vanished from the docks, refusing to work in a harbor that was now a target. The British authorities were humiliated. The telegraph wires buzzed with angry messages between Calcutta, London, and the naval stations. How could a lone light cruiser, thousands of miles from its home port, slip past the Royal Navy and bombard a city? The press in London was scathing. The prestige of the empire had suffered a grievous wound. The word Emden entered the local vernacular in the Tamil language. It became a synonym for someone who is daring, resourceful, and perhaps a little terrifying. Mothers would tell their children that the Emden would come for them if they did not behave. The ship had transcended its physical form and become a legend, a monster that lurked just over the horizon. For Captain Miller, The attack on Madras was a masterstroke of diversion. He knew that the Admiralty could not ignore this. They could not simply reroute shipping anymore. They had to hunt him down. The attack forced the Allies to pull warships from other vital theaters. Cruisers that were needed to escort troop convoys from Australia and New Zealand, or to guard the trade routes in the Atlantic, were now being ordered to the Indian Ocean with a single directive: sink the Emden. By lighting the fires over Madras, Miller had placed a target on his own back, far larger than before. He had poked the lion in its own den. He knew that the response would be overwhelming. A dozen warships, perhaps more, would now be converging on his last known position. The net was no longer just tightening. It was being cast with a vengeance. As the glow of the burning oil tanks faded behind him, disappearing into the curvature of the earth, Miller studied his charts again. He could not go north. The British would expect that. He could not stay in the Bay of Bengal. The hunters would scour every inch of it. He had to be unpredictable. He had to keep moving. The Emden had evolved from a nuisance into a strategic threat, and now she had to become a ghost once more. The voyage was far from over. The fires of Madras were a signal to the world that the German raider was still at large, but they were also a signal that the endgame was beginning. The hunt was on, and the Emden would have to run faster and fight harder than ever before. Chapter 4: The Massacre at Penang. The fires of Madras had barely cooled in the collective memory of the British Admiralty when Captain Carl von Miller plotted his next course. He knew that the Indian Ocean was shrinking around him. The telegraph wires were humming with news of his exploits, and the Royal Navy, along with their French, Russian, and Japanese allies, were coordinating a massive manhunt. Logic dictated that the Emden should retreat into the vast emptiness of the Southern Ocean to hide and wait. But Miller was not a man to hide. He understood that the greatest weapon he possessed was not his 10.5-centimeter guns, but the psychological terror he inflicted upon the enemy. To maintain that terror, he had to strike where he was least expected. He turned his bow not toward the open sea, but toward the busy, choke-point waters of the Strait of Malacca. His target was Penang. Penang was a vital hub for Allied shipping and a staging ground for warships patrolling the region. It was a harbor deep within enemy-controlled waters, guarded by picket boats and shore defenses. To enter it was suicide. To enter it alone, in a ship that every Allied sailor was looking for, was madness. Yet, this was exactly why Miller chose it. He gambled on the assumption that the British believed no German captain would be reckless enough to attempt such a feat. As the Emden approached the strait, the crew once again set to work on their disguise. The ship's carpenters and canvas makers, by now experts in theatrical deception, constructed a false fourth funnel. They erected it behind the 3-reel smokestacks using wood, canvas, and paint. From a distance, in the hazy light of dawn or dusk, the Emden no longer resembled a German light cruiser. Instead, she took on the silhouette of a British Yarmouth-class cruiser. It was a simple ruse, but in the days before radar, visual identification was everything. This disguise would buy them time, perhaps just enough minutes to get within torpedo range. The date was October 28th, 1914. The moon was setting, casting long shadows across the dark water as the Emden neared the harbor entrance. The tropical air was thick and humid. On the bridge, the tension was palpable. Every man knew that if the disguise failed before they entered the anchorage, the shore batteries would tear them apart. Miller ordered the ship to show no lights. They ran in total darkness, a shadow slipping between the waves. At the harbor mouth, a challenge was inevitable. A small picket boat, bobbing in the swell, spotted the 4-funneled warship approaching. The silhouette was familiar to the sentries. It looked like the HMS Yarmouth, a British ship known to be in the area. The picket boat did not sound the alarm. It did not fire a warning flare. It simply let the ghost ship pass, assuming it was a friend returning from patrol. The deception had worked. The Emden slipped into the inner harbor of Penang without a shot being fired. It was just after 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not yet risen, but the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. The harbor was crowded. Merchant ships lay at anchor, their crews asleep. But Miller was not here for merchant ships. His eyes scanned the water for gray hulls, the unmistakable color of warships. Deep inside the anchorage, he found what he was looking for. There, blazing with light, sat the Russian-protected cruiser Jemchug. It was a sitting duck. The Russian ship was not at battle readiness. Reports later suggested that the captain was ashore and the crew was largely asleep or resting. The ship was illuminated as if it were peacetime, a beacon inviting its own destruction. Miller wasted no time. He maneuvered the Emden into position, closing the distance rapidly. The German crew, disciplined and adrenaline-fueled, stood ready at their guns and torpedo tubes. They were less than 300 yards away when the order was given. A torpedo leaped from the starboard tube of the Emden, splashing into the dark water. Moments later, the silence of the Penang harbor was shattered. The torpedo struck the stern of the Jemchug. A massive column of water and debris shot into the air. The explosion rocked the Russian cruiser, lifting her stern and flooding the aft compartments. Immediately, the Emden's guns opened fire. At this point-blank range, the German gunners could hardly miss. Shells tore through the hull and superstructure of the Russian ship. The sound was deafening, echoing off the hills surrounding the harbor. On board the Jemchug, chaos reigned. Sailors scrambled from their bunks into a nightmare of fire and steel. Some attempted to return fire, getting off a few sporadic shots, but they were shooting blindly into the gloom. They could not see their attacker, only the muzzle flashes erupting from the darkness. Miller turned the Emden, bringing his ship around to deliver the coup de grace. He ordered a second torpedo fired. This one ran true, striking the Jemchug directly amidships, penetrating the hull, and detonating inside the forward magazine. The result was cataclysmic. A blinding flash turned the night into day for a split second, followed by a roar that shook the buildings in Georgetown. The Jemchug was blown in half. The explosion was so violent that debris rained down on the surrounding merchant ships. Within minutes, the Russian cruiser was gone, consumed by the harbor waters, taking 89 sailors and officers down with her. Only the mast tops remained visible, marking the grave of the unprepared ship. The violence had been sudden and absolute. The raid had lasted only a matter of minutes. Now the harbor was waking up. Sirens began to wail. Confusion swept through the anchorage. Merchant captains panicked, not knowing if a fleet had invaded. Miller knew his window of opportunity was closing. He had achieved his primary objective. It was time to vanish. He ordered the Emden to come about and head for the open sea. As they steamed toward the harbor exit, navigating through the smoke and the confusion, the lookout spotted another vessel approaching. It was a small ship coming in from patrol. It was the French destroyer Mousquet. The captain of the Mousquet, Lieutenant Théroigne, was in a hopeless position. He saw a four-funneled cruiser emerging from the harbor where explosions had just occurred. At first, he likely mistook the Emden for the British Yarmouth, just as the picket boat had. But as the Emden opened fire, the reality of the situation became terrifyingly clear. The Mousquet was a destroyer, fast but lightly armored, and outgunned by the German cruiser. Yet, the French sailors did not run. In a display of immense bravery, they engaged the larger enemy. The Mousquet fired a torpedo and opened up with her small guns. But the range was too great for the French weapons to be effective, and the German gunnery was precise. The battle was short and brutal. The Emden's shells hammered the small destroyer. The first salvos destroyed the Mousquet's bridge and engine room. Steam vented violently into the air as the boilers were hit. The French ship lost all power and began to list heavily. Within 10 minutes of the first shot, the Mousquet capsized and sank, slipping beneath the surface of the Strait of Malacca. The Emden was now alone again, save for the debris and the survivors struggling in the water. The port authorities were fully alerted. The telegraphs were screaming for help. Any prudent captain would have ordered full speed ahead to escape the retribution that was surely coming. Every minute spent loitering increased the risk of being intercepted by a superior force. But Karl von Miller was not just a tactician. He was a man of principle. He looked out at the water where the Mousquet had gone down. He saw the heads of the French sailors bobbing in the waves, clinging to wreckage, wounded and drowning. To leave them was a death sentence. To stop was to risk his own ship and crew. Miller did not hesitate. He ordered the engines to stop. The German raider, the scourge of the Indian Ocean, came to a halt in the middle of the enemy's sea lane. The crew of the Emden, who had just minutes ago been firing to kill, now rushed to lower the cutter boats. They threw lines over the side. The German sailors reached down to pull their French enemies from the oil-slicked water. It was a surreal scene. The smoke from the burning Zemchug still hung over the harbor in the distance. The sun was fully rising now, illuminating the rescue operation. The German sailors worked with urgency, hauling 36 French survivors onto the deck of the Emden. The French sailors were in shock. They expected to be left to die or treated harshly. Instead, they found themselves being tended to by the ship's medical staff. The German crew offered them whiskey and cigarettes, sharing their own rations with the men they had just defeated. One of the French officers was badly wounded. Despite the best efforts of the Emden's doctor, he would not survive the day. But for the moment, on the deck of the German cruiser, the war was suspended. There was no hatred, only the shared brotherhood of the sea. Miller came down from the bridge to ensure the prisoners were treated with dignity. He spoke to them in French, assuring them they were safe. This act of mercy, performed in the shadow of extreme danger, solidified the legend of the Emden. Miller had destroyed 2 warships and paralyzed a major port, but he had stopped to save lives when he could have simply run away. However, the clock was ticking. The smoke on the horizon signaled that other ships were approaching. The hunt was resuming. With the survivors secured, the telegraph in the wireless room picked up frantic signals from Penang calling for assistance. Miller ordered the engines to full power. The Emden turned her bow north, away from the carnage, away from the rescue, and back into the vastness of the ocean. As the coast of Malaya faded from view, the crew of the Emden took stock of the morning. They had struck a blow that would ring in the halls of the Admiralty in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. They had proven that no harbor was safe, that the Emden could strike anywhere, any time. But as Miller looked at the charts, he knew the reality. He had poked the hornet's nest again. The circle was getting smaller. He had embarrassed the Allied navies, and embarrassment breeds a desire for vengeance. They would not stop until the Emden was destroyed. The massacre at Penang was a tactical masterpiece, but it was also the beginning of the end. The ghost ship had haunted the seas for months, but ghosts cannot sail forever. Chapter 5. The fatal decision at Cocos. The victory at Penang had bought the crew of the SMS Emden a momentary sense of invincibility, but it had not bought them the one thing they needed most. That commodity was coal. The raider had been steaming hard for months, her furnaces devouring fuel at a ravenous pace to outrun pursuers and intercept merchant vessels. After leaving the smoking harbor of Penang behind, Captain Karl von Miller checked his reserves. The bunkers were dangerously light. To continue his campaign of disruption, he needed to meet his colliers, but he also saw one final opportunity to blind the Allied forces in the Indian Ocean. Miller studied the charts of the eastern Indian Ocean. His finger traced a line south, away from the shipping lanes of Bengal and toward a tiny, isolated speck of land known as the Cocos or Killing Islands. This coral atoll was more than just a tropical paradise. It was the nerve center of the British Empire's communication network in the region. Located on Direction Island, one of the small keys in the atoll, was a critical cable and wireless station. Undersea cables snaked out from this remote beach to Australia, Mauritius, and South Africa. If Miller could sever those lines and destroy the radio transmitter, he would plunge the entire region into a communication blackout. It would delay the coordination of the hunting pack searching for him and cause panic in the financial markets of Sydney and Melbourne. It was a bold plan, but it carried a heavy risk. To destroy the station, the Emden would have to stop. She would have to anchor. She would have to lower boats and send men ashore. For a few hours, the gray wolf of the ocean would be sitting still, vulnerable and exposed. Miller weighed the options. The strategic value of blinding the British was too high to ignore. He gave the order. The Emden set her course for Cocos. The journey south was tense but quiet. The crew used the time to repair the cosmetic disguise that had served them so well. They erected the canvas and wood structure that mimicked a fourth funnel, hoping to once again pass as a British cruiser if they were spotted on the horizon. By the early morning hours of November 9th, 1914, the low profile of palm trees rose from the sea. The Cocos Islands appeared as a serene idyll, a stark contrast to the violence the Emden had unleashed in Penang. The water was a brilliant clear turquoise, and the white sands of Direction Island looked inviting under the rising tropical sun. The Emden approached the entrance to the lagoon at Port Refuge shortly after dawn. Miller did not want to waste a moment. He ordered his first officer, the charismatic and capable Helmuth von Mucke, to assemble a landing party. Von Mucke was the heart of the crew, a man who commanded absolute loyalty from his sailors. He selected 50 men, including 3 officers, and 47 ratings. They were armed with rifles, pistols, and 4 machine guns. Their mission was specific and destructive. They were to disable the wireless station, cut the undersea cables, and return to the ship as quickly as possible. As the steam pinnace and 2 cutters were lowered into the water, the Emden remained near the harbor entrance. From the bridge, Miller watched the small flotilla motor toward the jetty. It was a picturesque scene, almost like a holiday excursion, were it not for the Mauser rifles slung over the sailors' shoulders. However, on Direction Island, the arrival of the 3-funneled ship had not gone unnoticed. The staff at the Eastern Extension Telegraph Company had been watching the horizon. At first, the silhouette of the warship confused them. The 4th funnel was up, suggesting a British light cruiser. But the keen eyes of the station operators noticed something was wrong. The 4th funnel rippled in the wind. It was fake. The realization hit them instantly. This was the Emden. Despite the German attempts to jam communications, the British operators acted with frantic professionalism. Before the German boats could even reach the jetty, the telegraphist tapped out a distress signal. It was short, urgent, and terrifyingly clear. It read simply, "Strange ship off entrance." They repeated it, "Strange ship off entrance." Then, they added the specific code for the Emden. The spark gap transmitter hissed and cracked, sending the invisible waves out into the atmosphere, desperate to find a receiver. On board the Emden, the wireless operators heard the transmission. They jammed the frequency with maximum power, trying to drown out the cry for help with a wall of static. They believed they had succeeded. They believed the signal had been strangled before it could travel far. It was a reasonable assumption. The ocean was vast, and the odds of an Allied warship being within range of that weak signal were astronomical. But luck, which had been Miller's constant companion for 3 months, was about to desert him. 50 miles away, a massive convoy of troopships was steaming toward the Middle East. Carrying the first contingent of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, this convoy was heavily escorted. Among the warships protecting the soldiers was the HMAS Sydney, a modern Australian light cruiser. She was faster than the Emden, better armored, and armed with larger 6-inch guns. The wireless operator on the Sydney picked up the jagged, interrupted distress call from Cocos. The message was garbled, but the meaning was clear. The Emden was at Direction Island. The convoy commander ordered the Sydney to break formation and investigate at full speed. Back on the island, von Mucke and his men stormed the jetty. They moved with military precision, sprinting across the white sand to the cable station buildings. The British civilian staff surrendered immediately. There was no resistance. In fact, the interaction between the German raiders and the British civilians became one of the most surreal moments of the war. It was conducted with an almost Victorian sense of sportsmanship. Von Mucke apologized for the intrusion and informed the superintendent that he was going to destroy their equipment. The superintendent, maintaining a stiff upper lip, simply asked that the Germans not damage the tennis court. The Germans set to work. They smashed the wireless transmitters with sledgehammers. The sound of breaking glass and crunching metal filled the tropical air. They toppled the massive wireless mast, watching it crash into the palm trees. But the hardest work was yet to come. They had to find the undersea cables. The station staff had buried the location of the cables, but the Germans were thorough. They located the thick, armored lines where they entered the water. It was backbreaking labor. The German sailors had to drag the heavy, slime-covered cables up onto the beach. The protective sheathing was thick, designed to withstand the pressures of the deep ocean. The men hacked at them with axes and sawed at them with files. Under the baking sun, stripped to their waists, they worked feverishly. Finally, with a resounding snap, the cables were severed. The connection between Australia and the world was cut. Von Mucke was pleased. The mission was a success. The station was silenced. He gathered his men to return to the boats. The mood was light. They had struck another blow for the Kaiser, and they had done it without spilling a drop of blood. The British staff even shook hands with the German officers as they prepared to depart, congratulating them on a job well done. It was a scene from a bygone era of chivalry, a moment of civility before the storm. On the Emden, Captain Miller was waiting. He was anxious to get moving. He had a rendezvous with his collier, the Burlesque, which was scheduled to meet them nearby to replenish their empty bunkers. The smoke of a ship appeared on the horizon. Miller smiled. He assumed it was the Burlesque, right on time. He ordered the signalman to contact the approaching ship. But there was no reply. The smoke grew thicker. The ship was moving fast, too fast for a collier. Miller raised his binoculars. The shape of the hull began to resolve through the heat haze. It was not a merchant ship. The masts were tall and military. The bow wave was massive, indicating a vessel charging at full power. A cold realization washed over the bridge of the Emden. This was not a friend. This was a hunter. The alarm bell shattered the peace of the morning. The siren on the Emden's funnel bellowed a long, mournful recall signal. It echoed across the lagoon, startling the birds from the trees. On the jetty, Von Mucke froze. He heard the siren. It was the signal for immediate return. Steam up. Prepare for battle. He shouted orders to his men to sprint for the boats. They scrambled into the pinnace and the cutters, their rifles clattering against the gunwales. The engine of the steam pinnace roared to life, churning the water white as they desperately tried to race back to their mother ship. But it was too late. From the bridge, Miller could see the enemy clearly now. It was the HMS Sydney. She was closing the distance rapidly, her guns already training on the German raider. Miller made a quick calculation. If he waited for Von Mucke and the landing party, the Emden would be caught at anchor. She would be a sitting duck, unable to maneuver, and would be blown out of the water in minutes. To save his ship, to have any fighting chance at all, he had to move now. He looked down at the small boats struggling against the current in the lagoon. He looked at his first officer, his friend, and 50 of his best men. He knew he was leaving them behind. It was the hardest decision of his command, but the safety of the ship came first. Anchor up, Miller shouted. Full speed ahead. The Emden's anchor chain rattled as it was hauled in. The propellers bit into the water, kicking up mud and sand. The ship began to turn, her stern swinging away from the island. On the small boats, Von Mucke and his men watched in disbelief as their ship began to steam away from them, heading out to meet the gray giant rushing toward them from the horizon. They were stranded. The 50 men sat in their small boats, bobbing in the turquoise water, watching the drama unfold. They saw the Emden raise her battle flags. They saw the black smoke pour from her funnels as the stokers shoveled the last of the coal dust into the furnaces. And then they saw the first flash of light from the horizon. The HMS Sydney had opened fire. The first shell splashed into the sea, falling short, sending a geyser of water into the air. The sound of the explosion rolled over the water seconds later, a dull, heavy thump that signaled the end of the raiding cruise. The Emden did not run. She turned her bow toward the enemy and fired back. The tranquil silence of the Cocos Islands was shattered by the roar of naval artillery. For the men left on Direction Island, there was nothing to do but watch. They were spectators to their own ship's execution. They scrambled back onto the beach, dragging their machine guns and rifles with them, digging in among the palm trees. They did not know what the outcome would be, but deep down, looking at the size and speed of the approaching enemy, they knew the Emden was outmatched. The trap had been sprung. The decision to attack the cable station, to stop for those few critical hours, had given the Royal Navy the opening they had been waiting for. The ghost ship had finally been caught in the daylight. Chapter 6. The Arrival of the Sydney. Just 50 miles to the north of the Cocos Islands, the morning of November 9th began as a routine day for the Australian convoy escort. The ocean was calm, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A massive fleet of 38 transport ships was steaming slowly toward the Middle East, carrying thousands of soldiers from the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the men who would soon be known to the world as the Anzacs. Protecting this vulnerable procession of troopships were the warships of the escort duty, vigilant against the threat of German raiders. Among them rode the HMAS Sydney. On the bridge of the Sydney, Captain John Glossop was overseeing the formation when the wireless room sprang into sudden, frantic activity. The operators had picked up a sharp, desperate signal cutting through the static. It was the distress call from the wireless station on Direction Island. The message was fragmented and urgent. It screamed of a strange warship at the entrance to the harbor. Then, the transmission abruptly cut out. The silence that followed was ominous. The senior naval officer of the convoy, Captain Silver, on board the HMS Melbourne, immediately understood the implication. The wireless station had been silenced by force. There was a predator nearby. Captain Silver assessed his options quickly. He could not leave the convoy unguarded, but he could not ignore the enemy sitting just over the horizon. He needed a ship with speed, range, and heavy firepower to investigate. He signaled the Sydney. Captain Glossop received the order to raise steam for full speed. The Sydney broke formation, her bow swinging sharply toward the south. As she pulled away from the slow-moving transport ships, the tempo on board changed instantly. The boredom of escort duty evaporated. The crew of the Sydney, young and eager for their first taste of combat, raced to their battle stations. The HMAS Sydney was a formidable machine, a town-class light cruiser launched only the previous year. She was the pride of the fledgling Royal Australian Navy. Unlike the Emden, which was a slightly older design intended for colonial patrol and communication, the Sydney was built for the express purpose of hunting down and destroying other ships. She represented the new generation of naval engineering. Her engines were fresh, her hull was clean, and her magazines were full. As the stokers in the boiler room shoveled coal with rhythmic fury, the ship began to shudder with rising power, cutting through the water at over 25 knots. She was a greyhound unleashed, racing toward the last known position of the German Ghost. While the Sydney charged south, the mood on the SMS Emden was shifting from routine to alarm. Anchored in the lagoon, the German crew was waiting for the return of their landing party. The destruction of the wireless station was complete, and Captain Carl von Miller was anxious to move on. He was waiting for the Burresque, his captured collier, to join him so he could refuel his hungry bunkers. The lookouts on the Emden were scanning the horizon, expecting to see the familiar, lumbering shape of the coal ship. Around 9 in the morning, a lookout called out. He had spotted smoke on the northern horizon. A dark plume was rising against the pale sky. At first, the officers on the bridge felt a sense of relief. They assumed it was the Burresque, arriving right on schedule. But as the minutes ticked by, the smoke grew thicker and darker. It was moving too fast. A merchant ship laden with coal produces a lazy, drifting trail of smoke and moves at a slow, economical pace. The smoke approaching Direction Island was pouring from the funnels of a ship being driven to its absolute limit. Captain Miller raised his binoculars, fixing his gaze on the northern horizon. Below the smoke, the superstructure of the approaching vessel began to materialize. He looked for the single funnel of a merchant ship. Instead, he saw masts. He saw the fighting tops of a warship. As the vessel drew closer, the silhouette became undeniable. It was not the Burresque. It was a four-funneled cruiser approaching at high speed. The realization hit Miller with the weight of a physical blow. The trap had closed. For 3 months, he had outsmarted the combined navies of the Allied powers. He had used stealth, deception, and the vastness of the Indian Ocean to vanish and reappear at will. But now, physics and geography had conspired against him. He was anchored in a lagoon with cold boilers. Part of his crew was on shore, and a superior enemy was closing the distance at 25 knots. The sirens on the Emden began to wail. It was the emergency recall signal, a desperate plea for the landing party to return to the ship immediately. But even as the sound echoed over the water, Miller knew it was futile. Lieutenant von Mucke and his 50 men were still on the beach, scrambling to get their schooner ready, But there was simply no time. Every second the Emden remained at anchor was a second the Sydney used to refine her firing solution. Miller faced the hardest decision of his command. If he waited for his men, the Emden would be destroyed while sitting motionless in the water, a stationary target for the Australian gunners. It would be a massacre. To save his ship, and to give his crew a fighting chance, he had to abandon the landing party. He had to leave 50 of his best men behind. With a heavy heart, he ordered the anchor raised. The steam capstan groaned as it hauled the heavy chain up from the coral floor. The process was agonizingly slow. The Sydney was growing larger by the second, her gray hull distinct against the blue water. Miller could not wait for the anchor to be fully secured. As soon as it broke the surface, he ordered the engines ahead. The Emden began to move, her propellers churning the turquoise water of the lagoon into white foam. He turned the ship toward the north, heading out to sea. He would not fight in the confined waters of the Cocos Group. He would not let the stray shells of the enemy rain down on the island where his own men were stranded. He would draw the Australian cruiser away into the open ocean. It was a gallant move, but as the Emden picked up speed, the disparity between the two combatants became painfully clear to every officer on the German bridge. This was not a battle between equals. It was a confrontation between two different eras of technology and two vastly different physical conditions. The HMS Sydney was armed with 8 6-inch guns. These were modern, long-range weapons capable of firing a projectile weighing 100 pounds. When a 100-pound shell struck a ship, it could tear through steel plating, wreck machinery, and cause catastrophic structural damage. The Sydney also possessed a centralized fire control system, allowing the gunnery officer to direct the fire of all guns simultaneously, adjusting for range and speed with mathematical precision. By contrast, the Emden was armed with 10 4.1-inch guns. These fired a shell weighing only 35 pounds. While the Emden had more guns, the weight of her broadside was significantly lighter. A shell from the Emden might damage the superstructure of the Sydney, but it would struggle to penetrate the Australian ship's armor belt. To do any real damage, the Emden would have to get close, dangerously close. Furthermore, the Sydney was protected by side armor meant to deflect incoming fire. The Emden relied mostly on the arrangement of her coal bunkers to absorb the impact of enemy shells. Against the heavy 6-inch rounds of the Sydney, coal bunkers would offer little more protection than cardboard. But the greatest disadvantage was the physical state of the ships themselves. The Sydney was fresh. She had recently come from dry dock. Her hull was smooth, and her engines were in peak condition. She could easily maintain high speeds for the duration of the battle. The Emden was a tired ship. She had been at sea for months, steaming over 30,000 miles without a proper overhaul. Her boilers were worn and leaking. Her condensers were patched and fragile. Most critically, her hull was fouled. After months in tropical waters without a cleaning, the bottom of the Emden was covered in a thick layer of barnacles, seaweed, and marine growth. This biological drag acted like a brake, stripping away her top speed. On paper, the Emden could do 24 knots. In reality, on that November morning, she would be lucky to reach 19. Captain Miller knew that speed was life in a naval engagement. Speed allowed a captain to choose the range. Speed allowed a ship to dictate the terms of the battle. Today, the Emden had no speed. She could not run. And she could not close the distance quickly enough to bring her lighter guns to bear. She was sluggish, heavy, and exhausted. As the Emden cleared the entrance of the lagoon, the fresh ocean breeze hit the faces of the German sailors. They looked at the approaching enemy. The Sydney was a magnificent and terrifying sight, her bow cutting a clean wake, her four-funnel smoking, her guns training around to track the German raider. The Australian ship had the weather gauge, meaning she could keep the smoke from her own funnels blowing clear of her view, while the Emden might be blinded by her own exhaust. On the bridge, Miller stood calm and upright. He knew the odds were impossible. He knew that the Australian ship could stay out of range of the Emden's guns and pound them to pieces with her heavier artillery. He knew that even if he managed to close the range, his shells would bounce off the Sydney's armor. But the Emden was a ship of the Imperial German Navy. She had terrorized the Indian Ocean with honor and chivalry. She would not surrender. If this was to be her end, she would go down fighting. Miller ordered the battle flags hoisted. The crisp naval ensign snapped in the wind, white flags with a black iron cross. Below decks, the stokers threw coal with desperate energy. They knew the engines were not up to the task, but they pushed them anyway. The temperature in the boiler room soared. The entire ship vibrated as the propeller shaft spun faster. The Emden leaned into the turn, putting herself between the island and the enemy. On board the Sydney, Captain Glossop watched the German maneuver. He admired the courage of his opponent. He saw the small cruiser coming out to meet him, a terrier charging a bulldog. He gave the order to prepare for action. The rangefinders on the Sydney began to call out the distance. 10,000 yards, 9,000 yards. The ocean between the two ships was a flat, glittering expanse. It was a perfect arena for gunnery. There was no swell to disturb the aim. There was no fog to hide the target. It was a mathematical equation of ballistics and steel, and the numbers were entirely in favor of the Australians. The Emden fired first. It was a gesture of defiance as much as a tactical move. At a range of nearly 10,000 yards, Miller ordered his gunnery officer to open fire. The starboard battery of the Emden erupted in flame and smoke. The ship shuddered as the 4.1-inch guns sent their 35-pound shells arching high into the air toward the Australian cruiser. The time of flight for the shells seemed to last an eternity. The men on the bridge of the Emden watched through their binoculars, waiting for the splash. They needed to know if their aim was true. They needed to know if they could even reach the enemy. The first salvo fell short, splashing harmlessly into the sea. But the second salvo found the range. The German gunners, hardened by months of drilling, were excellent marksmen. Even with their inferior equipment, they were deadly accurate. However, the Sydney was now ready to reply. Her turrets adjusted slightly. Her fire control director locked onto the silhouette of the Emden. The order was given. The 6-inch guns of the Sydney roared. The sound was deeper, louder, and more resonant than the report of the German guns. The heavier Australian shells screamed through the air. When they landed, they did not just splash, they erupted. The water geysers were higher, the concussion stronger. As the Emden steamed desperately northward, trying to close the gap, Captain Miller watched the fall of the enemy shot. He saw the water erupting around his ship. He saw the flash of the Australian guns on the horizon, relentless and rhythmic. He realized that the Sydney was not just faster and stronger. She was being handled with professional coldness. The Australians were keeping the range open. They were using their speed to stay exactly where they wanted to be. Far enough away that the Emden's shells lost their energy, but close enough that their own heavy shells struck with devastating power. The technical mismatch was no longer a theory on paper. It was a terrifying reality unfolding on the water. The Emden's boilers groaned under the strain, unable to give Miller the extra knots he needed. The barnacles on her hull dragged her back like invisible hands. And across the water, the Sydney moved with the effortless grace of a machine that was newer, stronger, and built for this exact moment of execution. The chase had ended. The hunt was over. The battle had begun, and the Emden, the Swan of the East, was fighting for her life against a predator she could not outrun and could not outgun. The arrival of the Sydney marked the end of the Raiders' freedom, closing the book on her months of unchecked dominance. Now, it was only a matter of how long she could endure the inevitable. Chapter 7, The Slaughter of the Swan. The first salvo from the Emden tore through the tropical air, marking the end of the gentleman's war. For months, Captain Carl von Miller had played a game of cat and mouse across the Indian Ocean, sinking merchant vessels with a polite efficiency that earned him the respect of the world. He had stopped ships, checked their papers, allowed crews to evacuate, and then sent the empty hulls to the bottom. There had been almost no bloodshed. But as the shells from the Emden arched toward the HMAS Sydney, the reality of naval warfare shattered that chivalrous illusion. This was no longer a raid on an unarmed collier. This was a duel to the death against a superior enemy. The German gunners, hardened by months of drilling, proved their worth in the opening minutes. They fired with incredible speed, their 10.5-centimeter guns barking in rapid succession. The Emden landed the first blow. A German shell slammed into the Sydney, destroying its rangefinder and killing the operator. For a brief, flickering moment, a cheer went up across the German decks. They had drawn first blood. They had blinded the Australian giant. But the celebration was swallowed by the terrifying realization of physics. The Emden had to elevate her guns to their absolute limit just to reach the Sydney. Her shells were falling at a steep angle, plunging down from the sky, relying on gravity as much as velocity. In contrast, the Sydney was just finding her rhythm. The Australian cruiser was armed with 6-inch guns, weapons that threw a projectile twice as heavy as those of the Emden. When the Sydney finally calculated the correct range, the return fire did not come as a warning shot. It came as a sledgehammer. The first heavy hit on the Emden was a shockwave that rattled the teeth of every man on board. The shell did not just punch a hole in the steel. It tore the ship open. The explosion ripped through the wireless room, instantly killing the operators who had been tapping out the desperate signals to the landing party back on Direction Island. The nervous system of the ship was severed in a split second. Then came the fire. The British-designed Lyddit shells fired by the Sydney were notorious for the heat and devastation they caused. Upon impact, they unleashed a violent yellow toxic smoke that choked the lungs and burned the eyes. Fires erupted across the midships, fed by the tropical heat and the dry timber of the deck. The paint on the bulkheads blistered and peeled as the temperature inside the hull began to climb. Captain Miller stood on the bridge, his white uniform stained with soot, watching his ship disintegrate around him. He ordered the helm over, trying to close the distance. If he could just get close enough, perhaps he could use his torpedoes. It was a desperate gamble, a charge of the Light Brigade at sea. But the captain of the Sydney, John Glossop, was too smart to allow it. He saw the Emden turning, saw the white foam rising at her bow as she tried to sprint, and he simply turned away. The Sydney used her superior speed to keep the range open, holding the Emden exactly where she wanted her. The Australian ship danced on the edge of the horizon, a distant gray silhouette that rained death with impunity. The Emden was trapped in a lethal circle, unable to run and unable to reach her tormentor. The destruction of the Emden began to accelerate. The fore funnel, the tall smokestack that had been part of her disguise for so long, took a direct hit. It shuddered, the metal groaning like a dying animal, before toppling over the side. A great plume of black smoke and steam erupted from the wound, blinding the gunners and choking the engines. The ship, once graceful, now looked broken and asymmetrical. Below decks, the engineering crews were fighting a battle just as heroic and just as hopeless as the one on the surface. They shoveled coal into the furnaces with frantic energy, trying to keep the steam pressure up even as the ventilation fans failed. The heat in the boiler rooms became unbearable. Men worked in a haze of coal dust and steam, unaware of exactly what was happening above, only knowing that the hull plates were shuddering with every impact. On the gun decks, the slaughter was absolute. The shield protection on the Emden's guns was designed to stop splinters, not heavy artillery. When the Sydney shells struck the gun positions, they wiped out entire crews in a flash of orange fire. Reserves rushed up from below to take the places of the dead, slipping on blood and spent shell casings, loading and firing until they too were cut down. The Swan of the East, known for her beauty and clean lines, had become a slaughterhouse. A second funnel was blasted away, crashing onto the deck and crushing the lifeboats. The Emden was losing power. Her speed dropped. She was no longer gliding through the water. She was limping, heavy and sluggish. Then the steering gear failed. A shell severed the connection between the wheel on the bridge and the rudder at the stern. The ship stopped responding to Miller's commands. She was now drifting, a burning hulk subject to the wind and the waves. Unable to bring her remaining guns to bear, Miller had to steer the ship using her propellers, slowing one engine and speeding up the other to twist the vessel in the water. It was a clumsy, agonizingly slow way to maneuver a warship in the middle of a barrage. He looked out at his crew. The men were blackened by smoke, wounded, and exhausted, yet they stood by their stations. There was no panic, only a grim determination to do their duty until the end. But Miller knew the end had arrived. The ammunition hoists were destroyed. The guns were falling silent one by one, not for a lack of targets, but for a lack of shells and men to fire them. The Sydney was merciless. Seeing that the German flag was still flying, the Australian cruiser continued to pour fire into the wreck. Every few seconds, another explosion rocked the Emden, throwing debris high into the air. The heavy steel plating was twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Captain Miller looked toward the horizon. To the north lay North Keeling Island, a small, isolated strip of coral and sand topped with palm trees. It was a place of pristine natural beauty, surrounded by a jagged, dangerous reef where the surf pounded endlessly. It was a hazard to navigation, a place ships usually avoided at all costs. But to Miller, in this moment of devastation, it looked like salvation. He knew he could not win this battle. His ship was sinking. If he stayed in deep water, the Emden would eventually slip beneath the waves, taking hundreds of men down with her into the crushing depths of the Indian Ocean. He had to make a choice. He could fight on for honor and die, or he could swallow his pride and save his crew. The decision was made. Miller gave the order to the engine room. They were to give him every last ounce of power they had left. He was not turning to attack. He was turning to run. The Emden, burning from bow to stern, swung her nose toward the island. She was trailing a massive cloud of black smoke that blotted out the sun. The Sydney continued to fire, her shells splashing in the water around the retreating raider and tearing through the upper works. But the Emden kept moving. She was a dead ship walking, propelled by the sheer will of her captain and the desperate labor of the stokers below. As the island grew closer, the sound of the surf began to mix with the roar of the explosions. The turquoise water of the reef became visible, a stark contrast to the dark blue of the deep ocean and the red blood staining the decks. Miller aimed his ship straight for the flattest part of the reef on the southern shore of the island. The final moments of the Emden's voyage were a blur of noise and vibration. The ship raced toward the shore at 19 knots, a terrifying speed for a vessel about to collide with solid rock. Miller wanted to hit the reef hard. He wanted to drive the ship so far up onto the coral that she could never sink, ensuring that his wounded men would have a fighting chance to make it to shore. The impact was cataclysmic. With a grinding screech that drowned out the gunfire, the Emden slammed into the coral reef. The force of the collision threw men off their feet. The hull buckled and groaned as thousands of tons of steel met the immovable resistance of the earth. The ship plowed forward, crushing the coral beneath her keel, ripping her bottom open until friction finally overcame momentum. The engine stopped. The vibrations ceased. The Emden lay hard and fast aground, her bow raised high out of the water, her stern submerged in the breaking surf. She was no longer a ship, she was a wreck. The sudden lack of motion was disorienting. For a moment, there was a strange, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of flames and the cries of the wounded. The Sydney, seeing her opponent driven onto the rocks, ceased fire. The duel was over. Captain Miller stood on the ruined bridge, gripping the railing. He looked down at the devastation. The funnel debris cluttered the deck. The twisted metal of the gun shields looked like abstract sculptures of violence. The bodies of his crewmen, the young men who had sailed with him halfway around the world, lay scattered among the wreckage. The tropical sun beat down on the scene, indifferent to the tragedy. The water around the reef, usually crystal clear, was dark with oil and debris. The beautiful white paint of the Swan of the East was scorched black and riddled with holes. The survivors began to emerge from the bowels of the ship, blinking in the harsh light. They were dazed, their ears ringing from the concussions. They looked toward the island, just a few hundred yards away, where the palm trees swayed gently in the trade winds. It was a paradise, waiting to receive the castaways of hell. Miller's war was over. He had terrorized the shipping lanes, outsmarted navies, and become a legend in his own time. But here, on this remote jagged reef in the Cocos Islands, the physical journey of the SMS Emden had come to its violent conclusion. The ship would never sail again. She would remain here, rusting under the sun, a steel tombstone marking the end of the last corsair. As the smoke drifted lazily toward the sky, blending with the clouds, the crew began the grim task of abandoning ship. They prepared to lower themselves into the water, to swim from the burning iron to the sharp coral. The slaughter was finished. The legend of the ghost ship had ended not in a mysterious disappearance, but in a brutal, crushing defeat that left her broken bones exposed to the world. Chapter 8. The Odyssey of the Ayesha. While the main body of the SMS Emden lay ruined on the reefs of North Keeling Island, A different drama was unfolding just across the water. On Direction Island, the small detachment of 50 men stood in stunned silence. These were the members of the landing party, the men who had been sent ashore earlier that morning with rifles and explosives to destroy the wireless station. Led by First Officer Helmuth von Mucke, a tall and strictly professional officer, they had accomplished their mission on the island with efficiency. But while they were dismantling the radio mast, they had heard the siren of their ship. They had watched from the beach as the Emden steamed out to meet her fate. And they had listened as the thunder of the guns slowly faded into the distance. Now the silence returned to the lagoon. The smoke on the horizon told the men everything they needed to know. The Emden was gone. Her era of dominance was over. Von Mucke gathered his men on the white sand. They were stranded on a British-held island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The Australian cruiser Sydney, having finished off their mothership, would surely turn its bow toward Direction Island to collect the remaining Germans as prisoners of war. For most men, the logical course of action would be to sit down, wait for the enemy, and accept a polite captivity. But Helmuth von Mucke was not like most men. He looked at his crew, a mix of sailors and officers who still carried their arms. He told them that the Emden might be dead, but her spirit was not. As long as they were free, they were still a fighting unit of the Imperial German Navy. Surrender was not an option. Their eyes turned to the lagoon. Anchored in the shallow turquoise water was a white three-masted schooner. Her name was the Ayesha. She was not a warship. She was a dilapidated sailing vessel used to transport copra, the dried meat of coconuts. She was old, her paint was peeling, and she had sat neglected in the harbor for quite some time. The British staff on the island, who had developed a strange and gentlemanly rapport with the German invaders during the occupation, warned von Mucke that the ship was unseaworthy. They explained that the bottom was rotten and that she leaked constantly. Von Mucke did not care. A leaking ship was better than a prison cell. With the discipline of a drill team, the German sailors seized the Ayesha. They worked with frantic energy. The HMS Sydney could return at any hour, so speed was their only defense. They loaded water, rice, and whatever tinned provisions they could find. They brought their rifles and 4 machine guns on board. The wireless station staff, displaying that peculiar chivalry that defined the early months of the Great War, actually helped the Germans load supplies, offering them cigarettes and wishing them luck on what they considered a suicidal voyage. By evening, the sails were raised. The Ayesha was a ghost from another century, creaking and groaning as she moved toward the channel. As the sun set, the schooner slipped out of the lagoon and into the darkening expanse of the Indian Ocean. Darkness was their cover. When the HMS Sydney returned to Direction Island the following morning to collect the landing party, they found only the empty beach and the amused British station staff. The birds had flown. Life on board the Ayesha was a test of human endurance from the very first hour. The British warnings had been accurate. The ship was in a pitiful state. The hull was so rotten that in some places the wood had the consistency of wet cardboard. The water tanks were filled with foul-smelling liquid that was barely drinkable. The most pressing problem, however, was the leaking. The old vessel took on water at an alarming rate. The mechanical pumps were rusted solid and useless, meaning the water had to be pumped out by hand. For the next several weeks, the 50 men lived in a cycle of exhausting labor. There was no space below decks for everyone, so they slept in shifts on the open deck, exposed to the tropical squalls and the baking sun. The kitchen was a primitive open firebox where they cooked rice and salt meat, but the pumping never stopped. To keep the rhythm and morale high, the sailors sang German folk songs as they worked the hand pumps, the melody keeping time with the mechanical clanking. They were a floating speck in a vast ocean, hunted by the navies of Britain, France, Japan, and Russia, sailing a wreck that wanted to sink beneath them. Von Mucke navigated with nothing more than a handbook and an old map he had found in the ship's archives. His goal was Penang, a port in the Dutch East Indies, now modern-day Indonesia. The Netherlands was neutral in the war, and he hoped to find a temporary haven there. Against all nautical probability, the Ayesha survived the journey. On November 27, 1914, the battered schooner limped into the harbor of Penang. The arrival caused a sensation. The local authorities and the ships in the harbor stared in disbelief at the white schooner flying the German naval ensign. The men standing on her deck were bearded, ragged, and filthy, looking more like pirates from a storybook than members of a modern navy. However, international law was strict. As a belligerent warship, even one as improvised as the Ayesha, they could only stay in a neutral port for 24 hours to refuel and resupply. The Dutch officials were sympathetic but firm. The Ayesha had to leave, or the men would be interned. Von Mucke managed to secure water and provisions, but he knew the Ayesha could not make the long journey back to Germany. He needed a new plan. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped out of Penang. Von Mucke had arranged a rendezvous at sea with a German merchant steamer, the Schweizing, which had been hiding in the region. In a tense operation on the rolling swells of the ocean, the 50 men of the Emden transferred from the rotting deck of the Ayesha to the steamer. It was a bittersweet moment. The Ayesha had saved their lives. They could not leave her drifting as a hazard to navigation, nor could they let her be captured. They bored holes in her hull. As the Schweizing pulled away, the men stood at attention and saluted. The brave little schooner, the savior of the landing party, slowly settled into the water and slipped beneath the waves, taking her place in history alongside the Emden. Now aboard the Schweizing, von Mucke formulated a daring plan. He disguised the steamer as a neutral Italian vessel and set a course for the Red Sea. His intention was to land in the Ottoman Empire, which had recently allied with Germany. If they could reach the Arabian Peninsula, they could travel overland to Constantinople and rejoin the war effort. The voyage was tense, as they passed right under the noses of British patrols, but the disguise held. They arrived near Hodeidah, in present-day Yemen, in early 1915. The sea voyage was over, but the land odyssey was just beginning. Von Mucke and his men were now soldiers of the desert. They traded their deck shoes for marching boots and their ship for a caravan of camels and donkeys. They were moving through a region that was technically Ottoman territory, but in reality, it was a lawless expanse of shifting sands and shifting allegiances. Bedouin tribes, incentivized by British gold to attack Ottoman interests, roamed the dunes. The march was grueling. The sailors, accustomed to the humid air of the ocean, now faced the dry, searing heat of the Arabian desert. They suffered from thirst, dysentery, and typhus. Yet their discipline never wavered. They marched in formation, dragging their machine guns through the sand. Their resolve was tested in a violent skirmish north of Jeddah. In the dead of night, their camp was surrounded by hundreds of hostile Bedouin raiders. The silence of the desert was shattered by the crack of rifle fire. For 3 days and nights, the sailors of the Emden fought a desperate defensive battle. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. The machine guns, which they had lugged thousands of miles from the Indian Ocean, proved to be their salvation. The disciplined bursts of fire kept the raiders at bay. Casualties were inevitable. 1 officer and 2 sailors were killed in the fighting. Several others were wounded. But von Mucke kept his head. He managed to negotiate a tense standoff and eventually secured an escape for his men. They buried their dead in the sand, far from the ocean they loved, and pressed on. The journey continued for months. They traveled by camel, by foot, and eventually by sailboat up the coast of the Red Sea, constantly evading British gunboats that patrolled the water. Every mile was a struggle against the elements and the enemy. But word of their journey had begun to spread. The story of the Emden men, traveling across the world to get back to the fight, became a legend in Germany and Turkey. Finally, they reached the Northern Hejaz Railway. The sight of the steel tracks was the sweetest thing they had ever seen. They boarded a train that took them through Syria and into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. On Pentecost Sunday, in May 1915, months after the destruction of their ship, the survivors of the landing party arrived in Constantinople. They had traveled thousands of miles by sea and land. They had lost their ship, stolen a schooner, crossed an ocean, hiked through a desert, and fought off armies of raiders. The scene of their arrival was historic. Admiral Suchan, the commander of the German Mediterranean Division, stood waiting to review them. Helmuth von Mucke, gaunt and weathered by the sun, his uniform faded and torn, but his posture erect, marched his men onto the parade ground. He halted them, snapped a salute, and delivered one of the most famous reports in naval history. He simply said, "I report the landing squad from the Emden, 5 officers, 7 petty officers, and 30 men strong." It was a moment of supreme triumph. They had refused to accept defeat. They had turned a disaster on a remote island into an epic of survival. The Kaiser was so moved by their journey that he issued a special decree. Every surviving member of the Emden's crew, including the landing party, was granted the hereditary right to add the suffix Emden to their surnames. It was a rare honor, ensuring that their families would forever carry the name of the ship that had carried them into legend. The Aesha was gone. The Emden was a wreck on a reef. But the crew had proven that a ship is made of more than just iron and steel. It is made of the spirit of the men who sail her. And that spirit had survived the fire, the sea, and the desert to return home unbroken.